Beautiful. I want to start today by telling you a story. In 1939, doctors and nurses throughout Nazi Germany received a questionnaire. This questionnaire asked them to fill out information about their patients with disabilities, their diagnoses, their estimated cost to society, and how frequently they received visitors. Over the next few years, the Nazi regime used this information to handpick the first victims of the Holocaust. The first people who were killed in Nazi Germany by gas chambers, the testing ground upon which Nazi Germany perfected their gas chamber technology, were people with disabilities, people who were seen as dispensable, and people who didn't receive visitors, people who were lonely. Loneliness kills. Today, our society is experiencing a crisis of loneliness. 1 in 5 people report being often or always lonely. The effects of loneliness have been equated to smoking a pack of cigarettes a day. It's linked to heart disease, dementia, depression. Loneliness can increase the risk of premature death by up to 50%. In Nazi Germany, 21st century Baltimore, and the world over, loneliness is particularly ravaging the disability community. 85% of people with disabilities report being lonely, and 1 in 8 spend less than 30 minutes a day with another human being. 1/4 of people with intellectual disabilities have no friends outside of their immediate family and caregivers. And I can tell you from experience that it can be lonely to live with disability. 7 years and 13 days ago, I entered a burn ICU with a rare autoimmune reaction to medication. And after a month-long medically induced coma, during which I lost most of my skin and the lining of my organs, I emerged alive from this hospital. But when I emerged, I was legally blind. The world that I entered as I left my hospital room was far different than I had ever realized. I had never before recognized how much our society prizes individualism and autonomy. Never before had I experienced the shame that comes from depending on other people in our culture. Learning to live with a disability was excruciating, but the hardest part wasn't figuring out how to graduate from college without being able to read the textbooks. It was navigating the social implications of my newfound disability. I could no longer drive to meet my friends or go to events like this. I could no longer recognize the faces of classmates or read nonverbal cues. And I continually felt like a burden to those who were close to me. People with disabilities overcome dozens of practical and physical barriers just to get out into their communities. Transport, sensory needs, all sorts of things. But once they're there, they face a whole slew of other invisible attitudinal barriers. Half of people without disabilities believe they have nothing in common with someone with a disability. And 1/4 admit to avoiding interacting with someone with a disability. It can be quite lonely to live with disability. Okay, so right about now you're probably wondering why I titled this talk, The Gospel of Unloneliness, because there hasn't been any good news yet. But here it is. The good news is that the solution to this epidemic of loneliness is actually rather simple. And I believe you already have the solution. Because I believe that God has created the church to be the antidote to our generation's crisis of isolation. And not just because of your dashing smile or your strong handshake. I believe that the church is the answer to isolation because we serve a God who models perfect community in his Trinity. And we follow a Jesus who in his life and ministry went to the places where people were lonely, the places where people were pushed to the edges of society, and he touched lepers, the blind, the lame. It's a beautiful thing to be able to follow that God. The good news is also that joining just one group can have the same effect on the life expectancy of someone who's lonely as quitting smoking. And having just 4 friends can cut the risk of dying from heart disease in half. People with disabilities who have friends outside of just their immediate family and their caregivers are more likely to practice healthy behaviors. But to me, the reason that we should care about loneliness is actually much deeper than its propensity to cause all sorts of early life-ending conditions. I believe that the problem is deeper than that, because I believe that loneliness is antithetical to God's design for man and woman. We were not meant to be alone now or in eternity. Christian ethicist Samuel Wells says, "Our culture's operational assumption has long been that the central problem of human existence is mortality. But what if it turns out that our greatest problem isn't mortality? What if it turns out that all along, humanity's greatest problem is isolation?" One of my favorite images in the Bible, and the image from which the Banquet Network gets its name, is found in Luke 14. In this parable of the great banquet feast, Jesus mandates his followers, when you throw a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, and the blind, and you will be blessed. Jesus knew that people with disabilities would be pushed to the edges of society, would be overlooked and shoved aside. He knew that they would be vulnerable to isolation. And yet, he made provisions for that in his church. And yet, for 900 million people in the world, we're missing that calling. It's estimated that 90% of the 1 billion people with disabilities in the world are unreached by the gospel and untouched by the church, making them the largest unreached people group in the world, and depriving the rest of us from the gifts and the blessing that comes from friendship with these individuals. Many churches find it overwhelming to think about caring for people with disabilities. But you don't have to be a specialist to address perhaps the most pervasive issue that people with disabilities face, their loneliness. A couple of weeks ago, I had another of my own battles with loneliness, being totally frustrated that I couldn't just hop in a car and get to this event at my church. But it wasn't a mobility aid or an innovation that saved me. It was Sarah, who came by my house on her way to church and picked me up, and Jason, who met me at the door and told me that the arrangement of the room had changed. It was Adam and Julie who saw me enter and came to have me sit with them. The answer to the loneliness epidemic for people with disabilities is people. Just 18 kilometers from the headquarters of the program that systematically decimated a generation of people with disabilities during Nazi Germany, there was a man named Otto White who had a small broom and brush making workshop. In his workshop, he employed dozens of people who were blind and deaf. And while the Nazi regime killed 300,000 individuals with disabilities, Otto fought for the lives of his employees, of his friends. For these men and women, the difference wasn't this well-thought-out plan or program. It was the fellowship of a true friend. Again, Samuel Wells says, if our greatest problem is isolation, then the solutions that we seek don't lie in the laboratories or the hospitals or the frontiers of human knowledge or experience. The solutions that we seek lie primarily in things that we already have, and most importantly, in one another. Loneliness does kill, but the gospel saves not just now, but for eternity. And you do have the solution to our generation's crisis.